Welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're tackling a topic that's pretty interesting, I think. We're going to be looking at what happens when, like, your personal values, clash with your love of books, and
Yeah.
specifically the ethics of curating a little free library.
Okay.
So our source material for this deep dive is an ethical dilemma that was posed to the ethicist columnist at the New York Times. And it all revolves around, these little free libraries. I think most people know what these are by now, but
Yeah.
just in case, they're those cute little boxes that are popping up all
Yeah.
over neighborhoods where you can take a book or leave one.
Yeah. It's a really cool idea.
Yeah, and they're usually decorated, all fun and
Right.
stuff.
Yeah.
So the dilemma is this. What if you are the person who set up the little free library and you believe very strongly in free access to information, but then someone starts donating a bunch of children's books that promote creationism
Hmm.
and argue against evolution as scientific fact? So, this little free library owner is, totally against banning books from schools or libraries. But what about in their own curated collection?
Right.
Can they, or even should they remove these books? It's a very tricky.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And the ethicist makes a really interesting distinction here. A private individual, who is just running this little free library for their neighborhood, they're not held to the same standards as like a public library, right?
Right.
They actually compare it to like how a hotel can choose what religious texts they want to put in their rooms. They don't have to offer every single belief system out there.
So it's really up to the curator of the little free library.
Yeah,
Kind of like their own personal bookshelf.
exactly. Now, the ethicist does acknowledge that things get a little bit more complicated when you start talking about um, libraries that are designed for kids, like school libraries. Age appropriateness, the educational goals of the school, what the parents want, all of
Yeah.
those factors.
Yeah.
It makes sense because, you can't just put anything in front of a kid.
Right, exactly.
So how does that idea of context, how does that play into the ethicist's view?
Well, they actually make an interesting point, and they give this example of a very progressive school in Brooklyn, let's say, that might choose not to include books that are considered, harmful or hurtful towards LGBTQ people.
Okay.
But then you could also have like a Christian academy in the South that might, not include books that are promoting those same
Right. So it's
perspectives.
both sides of the spectrum kind of drawing a line in the sand somewhere.
Exactly. And so they're saying even people who are really against book banning might still have some limits on what they think is okay, especially for certain age groups.
So where do they land then with our original little free library owner?
Hmm.
What do they say about those creationism books?
So they actually said the owner is totally free to remove them if they want to, but they make a really interesting point, and I'm kind of curious what our listeners think about this.
Yeah.
They say pulling those books probably isn't going to change the minds of parents who already believe in creationism, but for other parents, it might be a good opportunity to talk to their kids about why they disagree with what's in that book.
Right. So it could be almost like a
Yeah.
jumping off point instead of just pretending that these ideas don't exist.
Right, exactly. And I think they're kind of getting at the idea that, maybe there is some value in being exposed to ideas that you disagree with.
Yeah. Even if it's a little uncomfortable.
And they actually seem to lean towards a pretty open approach, especially for school libraries, because they say kids actually benefit from encountering lots of different viewpoints, even viewpoints their parents might disagree with. It helps them learn how to think critically, and it prepares them for a world where, there are lots of different opinions out there.
Right. So instead of shielding kids from, everything, maybe that little exposure helps them
Yeah.
build some mental antibodies or something, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so how does all of this, how does this apply to us in our everyday lives? Have you ever come across like something in a library or online or even just, walking down the street where you were just like, I totally disagree with that.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Right.
It happens all the time. But, do we just shut it out? Or do we actually try and understand where it's coming from? I think that's kind of what the ethicist is getting at here. And that actually leads us to this really interesting situation that they talk about where a parent writes in and they're, totally on board with books, totally against banning them, but they have a 6-year-old son who is obsessed with these books that are, well, kind of rude.
Yeah, we're talking like Stinky Butt and Total Dork and that kind of thing.
Exactly. And this parent is worried that these books are actually teaching their kid to be disrespectful.
But they're also against, restricting what their kid can read.
It's a tough spot to be in.
It's tough.
Yeah.
You know, on the one hand, you want your kid to be polite and use nice language, but on the other hand, you don't want to be like the book police, you know,
Right.
in your own house.
Right.
So what does the ethicist have to say about this? Is it just like surrender to potty humor?
Well, thankfully, there is a sort of middle ground here. The ethicist basically says that, grown-ups, they can choose what they want to read, but parents have a special responsibility to guide their kids, especially when they're really little.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like we let a 6-year-old just watch any movie or browse the internet freely or anything like that.
There is this balance, right, between giving them freedom to explore and making sure that they're not, getting into things that are harmful or
Right.
way over their heads.
Yeah, yeah. So they're not saying to like completely ban those books though, right?
Yeah. No, they actually say it's fine for the parent to say something like, hey, I think that word is kind of rude.
Go.
And here's why,
So it's more about using it as a teaching moment,
Yeah.
like explaining that some words are okay for silly books, but maybe not okay to like shout out at grandma's house.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about teaching kids, that different situations call for different ways of speaking.
Yeah.
And maybe even, the parent could suggest some books that are funny in a different way, at least some of the time.
So perhaps there is a world where we can have Captain Underpants and good manners.
I hope so.
Right. Fingers crossed. Well, this whole conversation has really gotten me thinking about, it seems like one of the biggest takeaways here is that context really matters.
Yeah, it does.
Whether it's a little free library or a kid's bookshelf, like what's appropriate isn't always just a simple yes or no.
Right. There's a lot more nuance to it. And
Yeah.
it forces us to really look at, what do we believe and why? What are we okay with and what are we not okay with? What are the reasons behind those feelings?
I think it's really easy to have strong opinions about like big issues like book banning, but then we actually have to make decisions about,
Right.
What's appropriate for yourself or your kids.
Yeah.
It gets a lot more complicated.
But it's five. Absolutely. It's about, finding that balance between allowing freedom of expression, but also being responsible members of a community and thinking about, what we read or what we share with others, how that might affect other people.
So as we kind of wrap up here, I mean, what are some of the key things that we've learned from this deep dive into the ethics of book selection? I mean, we started with that little free library question, which seemed kind of simple at first, but
Yeah.
we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. I think, we've seen that, someone who's just curating their own collection, they have a little bit more freedom than a public institution, which has to try to represent a broader range of viewpoints. We've also seen that even people who are against censorship might still have some limits on what they think is okay, especially for kids.
Yeah. And I think, maybe one of the most important takeaways is that, encountering a variety of viewpoints, even ones that you might not agree with, can actually be a really valuable thing. It helps you think critically, and it helps you understand the world better.
Absolutely. It helps you understand that there are lots of different ways of looking at things, and that even if you disagree with someone, you can still respect them as a person.
It's really amazing how a question about like a little free library, led us to all these big ideas about censorship and, freedom of expression and like being responsible for the information that we put out there.
Yeah, it really shows how these everyday situations that we find ourselves in can actually bring up these really deep ethical dilemmas that we all face,
And what's really interesting to me is that there isn't always a clear-cut answer.
Right.
Like, even with the little free library dilemma, the ethicist didn't just say like remove the book or keep the book.
Right, right.
They actually gave a very thoughtful response. It like acknowledged the complexity of it.
Yeah.
And encouraged the library owner to really think through like their own values
Right.
and the potential impact of their choice. So
Yeah.
I think that's what's so cool about these deep dives. It's not about us giving you a set of rules to follow.
Mhm.
It's really about like prompting you, the listener, to ask yourself these tough questions and like really grapple with these nuanced issues.
Exactly. And maybe even challenge your own assumptions a little bit. So as we wrap up, is there one final thought that you would like to leave our listeners with? Something that will like really stick with them?
I would say, the next time you come across an idea or a belief that makes you go, wait, what? Try to resist that knee-jerk reaction to just like shut it down or, get defensive.
Yeah.
Instead, try to ask yourself, why do they believe that? Try to understand, where they're coming from, even if you don't agree. It's like that saying, like, you can't really understand someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes, right?
Maybe.
Maybe. Like, trying to see things from their perspective can help us all kind of navigate this world of, conflicting information and strong opinions a little bit better.
Yeah. And who knows, you might even learn something new along the way.
Absolutely. Well, keep those minds open, keep those conversations flowing, and keep exploring those little free libraries, even the books that, make you raise an eyebrow. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.